And we are recording today. That probably just flashed up on your screen so that you are aware we are recording. Welcome to our second pop-up PD for literacy, LBS literacy educators. The first one for this current fiscal year was last June, and that was an overview of some of the new resources that had been developed in the field over the previous year. And today we're delving into a pretty big topic, looking at a couple of other reports in our CaMS system. You might recall we did one or two webinars last year around reports, which I'll reference in a moment or two. First, I would, of course, like to begin by acknowledging that we are coming from many different parts of the province today and on a large variety of different Indigenous lands. And although we are meeting virtually, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands that each of us calls home. We do this clearly to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this home. So on that note, bonjour, Ani, hello, and welcome. Very briefly, if you happen to be new to attending a pop-up PD session, there's just a few points on the screen now about our pop-up PD committee and how we work together to develop some free webinars each year. Quite a few years ago, we used to call this the online community of practice, but decided that didn't really capture the name. So a couple of years ago, we changed the name to pop-up PD. And obviously, many of you have attended prior pop-up PD sessions. If it's your first time, welcome, and we hope that you enjoyed today's session. I always have to make sure I put my name in a slide or I forget to introduce myself when I do webinars. Doesn't happen in person, but it happens when I do webinars. So I'm happy to be with you today. My name is Barb Glass. I'm the Executive Director of the College Sector Committee for Adult Upgrading, or the CSC, as we usually call it. That is one of the sectoral support organizations for LBS in the province. Very happy to be here today. My colleague, Wendy Olson, who is the ED of Literacy Link Northwest, is here as a moderator. She'll help keep an eye on the chat. We may or may not hear from Wendy, but we're glad she's in the background. Of course, we do have tech support today from Contact North, and Stacy is with us. I encourage you, if you're having technical difficulties, type something into the chat. You could send it even just directly to Stacy, and she will keep an eye on the chat to help with any technical issues that might come up. And of course, a big welcome to our two American Sign Language interpreters, Carolyn Lazonsky and Mike Glover. Finally, just a quick special thanks to my good friend and colleague, Robin Cook-Ritchie. Many of you know Robin. She also often delivers webinars, and she and I share a lot of work and resources. So we combined our efforts on a few of the slides today, and I appreciate her being willing to share that. Jumping right into today's session. First of all, if you have a question, I will definitely be happy to try and address it during the webinar. Easiest, again, just type it into the chat. I have my chat open here. Wendy, our moderator, has her chat open. Stacy has the chat open. So I will try to address the questions as they come up. If I miss something, Wendy will jump in, but I will try to keep an eye on them. There are a couple of times when I will certainly invite your comments on, as a more open-ended question. And again, we'll type into the chat and have a look at some of those responses. And thank you, Stacy, again, for typing the tech support phone number into the chat one more time. We do always offer and encourage you to complete a short evaluation, just 5 or 6 questions toward the end of the webinar. Probably around 3 o'clock, Stacy will copy the link for the evaluation into the chat. And again, really quick, just if you can click on it right from the chat, you can open it up and do the evaluation for us. And she'll put it in later in the webinar as well. I have a feeling we probably will take most of the hour and a half that is allocated, but if you have to leave early, we'd still love to, if you can complete the evaluation. So around 3 o'clock, Stacy will put that in the chat for the first time and then add it in a couple more times. Today, here's our short agenda. Well, an hour and a half's agenda. We'll start with a little bit of a review of our performance management measures in our LBS system, what we're accountable for to the ministry. We'll do a brief little review of report 64, the detailed service quality report, or what we usually refer to as the DSQ 64, because it's very difficult to talk about any other reports if we don't first talk a little bit about the performance management measures and report 64. And then also very briefly, number 3, just a few other all of the reports that are available in CAMS. I'll show you a list of them. But what we're really here to do today is to talk about number 4 and 5. So to take, as I said here on the agenda, a deeper dive into report 60B, and oh, I made a typo. Should say number 5 should say LBS outcomes report 60D. I probably did a cut and paste there. So 60B and D, as we said in our title slide. And then finally, we'll take a quick preview at report 61. It's something that would be a webinar all in itself, but we'll just take a quick preview of what it looks like. It's a little different than 60B and 60D. So don't see anything in the chat yet, so let's just carry on here. So number 1, just a review of our performance measures. This may be old hat for some of you. You might be very familiar with it. For some folks, this might be a little bit newer. I've just summarized the core measures in our LBS performance management system that the ministry, to which we're accountable to the ministry, for which we're accountable to the ministry. So I know you're probably familiar with them. We'll run through them quickly. We have customer satisfaction, we have service coordination, we have suitability, we have learner progress, and we have learners served. Notice that number 4 and 6 are blank when we look in this column that's called phase 2A. That's because currently we're not measured on number 4, which is completions, and number 6, which is learner gains. There's kind of placeholders in the ministry's performance management system for those 2 measures. Where you see phase 2B, you'll notice that completions are included and learner gains is also included. So at some future point, the ministry may decide to move to phase 2B. But right now, phase 2A is what we are directly responsible for and the measures on which we're evaluated. The percentages that you see in phase 2A are current. So for example, customer satisfaction as a measure is currently worth 15% of our grade or our monthly service quality measure. We have the other percentages listed here as they currently appear. In phase 2B, though, we don't know what those percentages might look like. That's because with 2 more added in phase 2B at some likely future point, then some of the phase 2A percentages will shift. That's also why the 40% and the 50% at the left-hand side here are in yellow, because that's what is currently represented. Customer service is worth 40. 15 and 25 give us 40. Effectiveness is worth 20 plus 30, which gives us 50. But in the future state in phase 2B, those percentages might change. Well, they would change so that we can still come out with 100% at the end. We don't have any details about phase 2B and when it may or may not be implemented. If you have been working in LBS for a long time, you would probably remember that completions, number 4, did originally count. It was originally a performance measure that counted for the first 2 or so years that we were under this new performance management system. And then in 2013-14, the ministry removed completions as a core measure. We were no longer actually measured on our completion data, but the completion data does still feed into our reports. We'll talk a little bit more about that after. So not seeing any questions in the chat. That's our, we'll carry on. Very briefly, the 4 and 6 that are not currently included involve the following. The completion measure has 3 elements to it. Learners who successfully complete all milestones, learners who successfully complete a culminating task, learners who successfully complete all the learning activities. Number 6, the learner gains measure was originally intended to be a pre and post test to measure skill gains using ministry recommended or endorsed tools. So that has never come to fruition. It's never happened, but it is technically part of phase 2B. And we'll see if that does get implemented at some point soon. Or later, sooner or later. So just a quick note, as I mentioned before, the data that feeds into number 4 does appear on our reports, but it's not used to measure our performance right now. Similarly, there is placeholders in CAMS for number 6 for learner gains, but there is no data for learner gains to input. And then just briefly, one more look at the performance measures just in the current iteration in phase 2A. Here's the weights, the same weights that I mentioned in the previous slide. Standard refers to what we're measured against. So for customer satisfaction, we are supposed to achieve a 90% rate of customer satisfaction. For service coordination, 50% of our service plans should have a referral, and so on. There's a lot of, a lot of calculation and data that goes into these measures and how they're presented to us as service providers. The recording of these measures is in the detailed service quality report 64. So we will just move on to number 2 on our agenda and talk very briefly as a refresher about the detailed service quality report 64. It really is the most important of our CAMS reports because it is the one that records our achievement of those performance measures that we just talked about in the last slide. And the ministry looks at it, and we must look at it, and we need to use it to help make improvements or to give ourselves a pat on the back because we're meeting all of the measures or most of the measures. It does come out monthly, and we also have to use it as service providers to complete our interim and final reports for the ministry, because on those reports, you or your site manager has to address for the ministry why you are or aren't meeting the required targets for those 5 core measures. And then my last little point about the DSQ 64 is that when you look at that report, you have to remember that it's based on closed files. So we'll talk a little bit more later about the difference between the active and closed files in some of our reports. The one measure that's based on both closed and open or active files is progress. The number of, excuse me, milestones that, number of students who have completed at least one milestone. That's based on both closed and open files, active files, I should say. Pardon me. If you would like to learn a little bit more about the DSQ report, I would encourage you to look at last year's pop-up PD session that we did last September on that topic. Stacy's going to copy that link into the chat, but it is available on the pop-up PD website that Contact North maintains. So thanks, Stacy, for just typing that into the chat. And it does include the recording and the slide deck. So that concludes the first two items on our agenda. We've had a look at the performance measures that we're accountable for. We've had a look at the DSQ 64 report. And now, just a brief introduction or reminder of some of the other reports that are available to us as service providers. I know it might be slightly small print here. This is a screenshot of from the EOIS-CaMS reporting site. I would just want to mention that you may or may not have access to any or all of these reports. It depends on what your user role and permission level is in the CaMS system. Some reports are staff level reports, some are manager level reports. So if you are a CaMS user, you may or may not have access to all of these reports. So your site manager is the person that would be able to access all of them or most of them. And but just a caution that not everybody can access all the reports. A short, small little distinction I can make here is that the ones that start with DF are a little bit different. DF stands for data files. And those are optional reports that your site manager or your SPRA can request. And they have a little more flexibility to allow us to run our own queries or try to get, different combinations of information out of them. We're not going to talk about the DF reports today, but just so you know, the DF reports are a little bit different, and they are really available by request, not necessarily to everyone. Another interesting piece about the reports is that the 4 reports listed here are available not just at the level of your site information, but they're also available with a roll-up of the regional data for all of the LBS service providers in your region, Central, Eastern, Northern, Western, as noted on the slide. There are also these roll-up reports for the whole province, so that you could look at a provincial report for any of these and see the figures and the data for all of the 315 or so LBS sites across the province, all rolled up together. In this webinar, there's a few places where I've just inserted a bit of the provincial data just for interest, for comparison. The reason why some of the other reports are not available as roll-ups is because they contain personal data, student names, birth dates, and so on. So obviously the ministry isn't going to produce provincial reports that have personal data in them. Only the people at your site who have access would be able to access those types of reports that contain personal data. One interesting resource I wanted to point out about reports is this summary document that's available on My EOIS. My EOIS is the portal that service providers can use to access announcements and information and resources about EOIS. You'll notice that it's 22 pages long because it doesn't just include a list of the LBS reports. It includes a list of all the different reports for all of the different Employment Ontario programs. And they're in order of number. So you can see 60A, for example, 60B, which we're going to be talking about today, they appear on page 6 because they're a little bit lower down in the list. I like this report, or I like this resource, this desk aid, because it just gives you a quick little snapshot of what's in a particular report and what format it's in and so on. So that is available on My EOIS if you look under desk aids. Today, we're going to, as I said earlier, focus on report 60B and 60D. Brief little preview of 61. So here's a quick preview of what's in 60B and 60D as well. 60B, which is the first one we'll talk about in a few minutes, has all of the profile information about your learners. An interesting thing about it that we'll talk about a lot in the next few minutes is that it does give you summary data for 4 of those 5 core measures that we talked about earlier, the ones that were measured on service, customer satisfaction, service coordination, and so on. 60D is our outcomes and follow-ups information. So needless to say, that's generally based on closed files. 60B is based on open or active files. I should be particular about using the word active because open and active are different things in CAMS. And then finally, 61 is a huge Excel report, which we couldn't possibly look at all of it in one today, but we'll look at a little bit of it. And every single data point you enter into CAMS appears on report 61. That's why it's such a big one, and that's why it appears in Excel, because it's by service plan, not by rolled up for your site. Just before we move right into 60B, I do want to remind everybody that for any of the reports we're talking about, a report guide is available on the EOIS reporting site and on My EOIS. A little harder to find things sometimes on My EOIS because I know they're still working on how that site is organized. And most of the information, both what I've already provided and what we'll be talking about in the next little while today, is really directly from the report guides. So they can sometimes be a little wordy and hard to read, but there's also some quite valuable information. Sometimes I've quoted directly from the report guides in my slides today. And then on the right, this is just a picture of the cover page of one of the reports, which this one is for reports 60A, 60B, and 60D. So I took some of the information today from this guide. All right, number 4 on our agenda. This is our deeper dive. So we'll delve right into report 60B now. 60B is produced as a PDF. It's about 9 pages long. It's generated in EOIS-CaMS every month. Really important to note that it's based on active plans. and it summarizes all of your service plan information and the learner profile information for your active service plans. As I mentioned before, it gives you summary data, which we'll see in a minute, for 4 of the 5 of the core measures that we're accountable for. So the DSQ has the exact measures and how we're doing in terms of our core measures. 60B gives you more insight into the data that goes into the core measures and how the numbers and why they appear as they do on the DSQ. Remember though, this important point at the bottom, you can't look at 60B and look at DSQ 64 and assume they will match, because most of the information in the DSQ is based on closed service plans, whereas 60B is based on active service plans. So that's a really important distinction about not being able to compare them. A couple of other little tidbits about 60B. It does include closed service plans if they were active earlier in the year. So if I started in your program in May and I was there till July, then I would appear in 60B from May to July as an active service plan. Then if you close my file in August, I will still be counted in the stats that are in 60B because I was active earlier in the fiscal year. Last point here. If I, as a learner, have more than one service plan, everyone is counted individually. So the report is generating data for individual service plans, not for unique learners. That's another important distinction about how the data is compiled in 60B. So let's jump right in and look at what 60B actually looks like. You might have seen it before, you might not have, depending on your role and what you do at your own agency. Most of the next number of slides are screenshots from a sample 60B report, and then later 60D and 61. So again, you might be familiar with what it looks like. If you're not, this is just the top of the page of the first page of the 60B report. In this blank spot here, that would normally be where the name of your site is entered. So I just deleted it that probably didn't really matter, but so as to not include the site name here for today. I'm going to pause here for a minute because I got a text, and Stacy, this is something probably for you. I got a text saying that the chat is disabled in this session. So Stacy, I'm just wondering if you can look into that while we carry on here. Oh, now Maggie says it's on. And now I can see lots of chat comments coming in. Great. Well, that's unfortunate. I'm going to pause just for a minute in case anybody wants to enter any questions and they weren't able to enter them in the chat in the last few minutes. Just going to pause for a few seconds. And I'll reply to my text that now it's working. Okay, Maggie has a question about her view. So I'm going to ask and let Stacy and the interpreters help out Maggie there. And I know Jeff's in the background too, who might be able to help. Megan, Barb, do we have to ask for access to the roll-up reports? No, that's a great question, Megan. You don't have to ask for access. When you log into the EOIS-CaMS reporting application, when you select that link, when you log into OneKey, there's a small banner, 1/3 of the way down the screen, and it will say SDS reports, which is service delivery site reports. And next to it, it'll say roll-up reports. So by default, it goes to the service delivery site level reports. But if you just click on the roll-up reports link in that little banner, you'll have access, you'll see the roll-up reports. And your site level reports will also be available if you click back on site level reports or SDS. Okay, I'll just pause again, just in case there's other questions coming in from this first half or the first little bit of the presentation. Okay, don't see anything else right at this moment, so let's just carry on. Last thing I'll point out about this slide, notice the year to date from April 1st to August 31st. So these are monthly reports, so I pulled this one out as the most recent one ending August 31st to use as a sample for today. And the following screenshots just go in order through the report. At the very top of the report, there's a summary of all the different of the new and carryover status of your service plans. In this particular site, it's a big site. So as of the end of August, they had 1,158 service plans, 373 new for this fiscal year, 785 were carryovers. Unique learners served, 1,157. So one of these learners has 2 service plans, which is why this says 1,158. Also tells you if you're perhaps partway through entering a file, and for example, there's an intake here with no client summary in there yet because it's probably in the middle of being activated. And then also tells you if you have service plans for someone who has exited and returned since the beginning of the fiscal year. And you'll notice as we look at these slides for 60B, some of the data points will have a number beside them. And those are the numbers that correspond to the core measures for which we're accountable. So that's why this report does directly relate to those core measures, because it's the data points that feed into the core measures are numbered, not in order, because number 7 is the last one. It's learners served target, but it does refer to core measure 7. And so for this particular agency, I happen to know their annual target is 2,060. So they're currently at 1,157 of their unique learners served for the year. Jackie asks, what makes a learner unique? It just means the individual person. So Jackie, you would be a unique learner. I would be a unique learner. But if we have more than one service plan, we will see, will be counted as, each of the service plans will be counted, but we will only count once toward the learner served target. So unique learner is the person, not the number of service plans they have. And even though the reports like these ones have all the service plan data, this is the number that counts toward your target, the unique learners served. Good question. Good clarification to make. Why would you have more than one service plan? Because maybe I come in and out of your LBS program more than once in a fiscal year. So perhaps I started in your program in May and I stayed there till July. Then I left, you closed my file. That's one service plan for me, one unique learner for this fiscal year. But let's say that I want to come back to your program in October. Well, you've already closed my file. You've already closed that service plan. If I come back in October or December or anytime in the fiscal year, you'll have to create a new service plan for me. Therefore, there'll be a closed plan and an active plan. But I, as a learner, will still just count once toward your learner served target, even though I might have come and gone from your program more than once during the year. Okay, just going back to the chat yet. Lisa says it would be more helpful if the header on the number column said all service. Yeah, I know. I agree, Lisa. Lisa's just saying that it would be better if this header at the top right said all service plans. Yeah, I agree, Lisa. Yeah. Okay, just scrolling back down in my chat here for a minute. I got to keep going back and forth between my screens. All right. So let's have a look at the next piece of the report. Right after the information about the intake status, we have about a page and a half of referral information. I haven't taken the full screenshots of the referral lists because they're very long and big. But the important things to remember here is that all the referrals in and out of your program will show early on in this 60B report. And it's categorized as referrals to other programs. And, you know, there's, I don't know, many in this, that's probably 12 possible referrals, and you would be familiar with many of those if you enter data in CaMS. There's referrals to other community services, again, a long list of referral types and categories, and then the different referred in categories. So all the referrals that you record in CaMS go into here. This agency, for example, had, as of the end of August, had 1,123 referrals to other community services. And you can see that they were pretty well educational academic service referrals, because that's what's noted here. They may have, they didn't have any referrals in the top category to other programs. They had 1,158 referrals in. So that means every service plan had a referral in. Because remember, on the previous page, the total number of service plans that we saw for this agency at this time of year was that 1,158. So every one of those had a referral in.
Excuse me, Barb, it's Wendy. We have Stephanie asking, will we have access to this recording or slides?
Great, thank you, Wendy. So yes, absolutely. The session is recorded and it will be posted on the pop-up PD website that's hosted by Contact North. And there's a couple of different ways you can access that. You can actually just Google pop-up PD and it should take you to the link. And Stacy can probably just pop that link into the chat as well. No pun intended. Pop the pop-up PD link in there. And there, she's already done it. So this will be posted next week. It takes about a week to get the recording and so on downloaded and organized. And I am going to go back to Stacy Dufton's question. Word of mouth does not count as a referral in, nor does a referral in from another LBS provider. You will see them recorded in this list a little bit down further. It didn't appear in this screenshot. The word of mouth referrals do appear, so you can see how many you've got, but they don't count toward your service coordination target, nor do referrals in from other LBS organizations. And if you don't, if there's zeros here, it just means you don't have referrals recorded for those particular categories. Just a couple of little calculations here briefly. to show you where the percentages come from. So I just got to move my Zoom screen down a bit so I can see my own arrows here. So where does this 97% come from? Comes from the fact that there was 1,123 referrals out of a total of 1,158 service plans that are included in this report. That's where the 97% comes from. Similarly, down here, it says that for referred in from EO apprenticeship program co-op diploma, it shows 11 referrals in. 11 out of 1,158 service plans gives you 1%. So this pattern of how the percentages are calculated appears over and over again in this report. I just wanted to illustrate it in one or two places as an example, so we could see how we were getting the percentages over here. Okay.
Barb, I'm not sure if you addressed this or not, but Gabriana asks what counts in referrals in.
Generally, everything except everything in the list of referrals in CAMS and in this report guide, except for word of mouth referrals and referrals from LBS, other LBS providers. All of the other ones do count. And I would encourage you to look at the list in the report guide for the full list of them. Another good question. So type into the chat. Why does it make a difference for us to look at the referral in and out numbers? How can they help us? What do they tell us? Just feel free to type a comment into the chat if you wish. Lori says service coordination. Yep. Seeing our service coordination, how we're doing. Absolutely. Work on relationships with referral partners. Yes. Gives you an idea of what agencies know or don't know about your programs. Exactly. ID gaps. Tell us where partnerships are strong and where they're not. Outreach. Absolutely. All those are good things. And most of those I've just sort of listed here in the next couple of points on this slide. Exactly just what you were saying. You know, do your referrals resonate with the profile of your community? And are there places where you can see you have really strong referrals? Are there referrals that you'd like to cultivate? And remember that just because you make a referral, it's only going to appear in this report if you record it. Excuse me. Next little section in the report is called Expenditures, and it does record your training support expenditures for the reporting period if you have put them into CAMS. This particular agency, this particular site does not use training supports, so that's why the values are 0. But it could also be 0 if they did have training supports and they hadn't entered them in CAMS yet. Training supports are entered as a plan item in CAMS. Megan says, is that mandated by the ministry to report them in CAMS, or is having documentation in the file enough? They do like them to go into CAMS, Megan. I will say ETCs that I've experienced have different preferences for how often you are required to keep them up to date. One common practice in the colleges, and I won't speak for all of the other sectors and streams at this time, but one common practice is to enter the total number of dollars of training supports when the file is closed. I know of other ETCs who have insisted that the training support funds be entered in CAMS weekly or monthly. But a common practice has been to enter them at closure so that it's kind of a summary at the end of the learner's time, and the training supports appear in the file when it's closed. if in CAMS as well. Okay, Simone says, I don't understand. Can you explain again? So Simone, I'm assuming you're asking about the answer to the question, why is this 0? So because most LBS agencies receive training support funds to provide learners with travel, childcare, etc., then there is a place in CAMS to record what you provide to each learner as part of their service plan. How much, did they receive a bus pass worth $50 this month, or did they receive mileage versus, worth $100? So there's a place in CAMS to make a plan item in the service plan to enter that figure for each service plan for each learner. If this particular agency, where we're looking at the sample report, if they had entered training support funds in CAMS for each service plan, they would appear here. And it would, like, maybe they had distributed $1,000 during the first 4 or 5 months of the year for this reporting period. They would also say the average support per learner. So the reason that the training support is 0 in this particular snapshot of the report is because this agency doesn't use any training supports. So that they will always be 0 because they don't have any training supports to give out. But if they did, it might be 0 because they haven't actually entered any of that training support information into CAMS yet for their service plans. Lisa, that's a good example of another sort of ETC preference as far as how it's tracked. So thanks for adding that in as well. My apologies in advance. The next slide contains the service coordination section as opposed to the referrals, the way they're itemized. And I really wanted to get them on one screen, so I apologize that the print is a bit small. On the next slide. This actually bleeds from one page onto the other in the report. I think it's maybe pages 4 and 5. So because all of these 2s are here, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go there. Because all of these 2s are here, these are the referrals that feed into the service coordination measure, which is measure number 2. So these categories are included in the previous section where all the individual referrals were listed, but now they're grouped together a little bit differently. And again, just a quick piece of information about how the percentage is calculated here. This particular agency had 264 referrals in from other organizations out of a total of 1,158 service plans. That gives us the 23% that we see here. We look down a bit further, excuse me, and we see they had a lot of referrals out to community services. They didn't have referrals out this year yet to some of these others. That's why they're 0s. But later in the year, there might be some figures in here. But remember again, that the numbers that you see here will not match the DSQ 64 service coordination numbers because this is active files and the DSQ is based on closed files. So you can't look at this and look at the DSQ and expect them to be the same. What does the service coordination data tell us? Well, it tells us really most of the same stuff as the general referral information does, but it does allow you to more specifically see if you're meeting the service coordination target in terms of the referrals that do count. And, you can sort of estimate in your mind, do at least 50% of your service plans have at least one referral in or out? Again, helps you to see if you're accurately recording referrals in and out, and if the referrals reflect the profile of your learner and your community and some of the partnerships that you have in place and so on. For example, if you're co-located with Ontario Works, you probably expect to have a reasonably large number of OW referrals. If you get lots of OW referrals, but you're not seeing them in this report, then you might need to go back and just double check how your staff are recording those referrals in CaMS. So it's kind of business intelligence that you're getting out of this, but business intelligence that feeds into one of the performance measures, which is service coordination. All right, Mira has a comment. The numbers that refer to core measures, where is that core measure chart found? I looked in the performance measure ministry agreement. They're not numbered that way in the agreement. What you want to look at is, yeah, they're not numbered that way. You need to look at the detailed service quality report 64 to see them itemized that way. And I don't know if you at your agency, at your LBS program, if you have access to the DSQ 64 report. If you don't, then your site manager should have access to it. And that's where those numbered performance core measures are listed in the DSQ 64 report. Wonderful. Excellent questions as always. So we'll carry on here. So learner profiles, the next section. And we've got age ranges. So this is the raw numbers. This is the percentages. We have preferred language of service and so on. Note the number 3 there, because we know, most of us would know, that one of the suitability indicators under core measure 3 is the number of learners we have between 45 and 64. There's no number 3 beside preferred language of service. It doesn't count toward the suitability measure. It's just another piece of data that's recorded in CaMS. Just out of interest, at this particular site, 88% of the learners are from 18 to 44 years old. And I get that because I'm adding up the percentages under 18 to 24, 25 to 29, and 30 to 34. Again, just out of interest, if you looked at the Ontario roll-up report, you would see that in Ontario as a whole, in LBS, 71% of the learners are between 18 and 44. So just a piece of provincial trivia. And there's a few more of those in there. As we keep going. Moving right along, the next little set of profile information. Yeah, Lori says 45 to 64 should wiggle in the near future. Yeah. You can definitely, I think we'd have 45 to 64 as an age range was a result of the 2008 recession, when a lot of older workers were laid off. And so when this performance management framework was developed, kind of not long after the recession, kind of in the 2010-11 years, there was still a lot of laid off workers in that 45 to 64 age category. That's why it appeared in here. But really, that's not our reality now in LBS. So now more number 3s, because these are more suitability indicators that make up part of the core measure of suitability. Person with disability, Aboriginal, deaf, deafblind, and francophone. Even though visible minority and newcomer are kind of inserted in here, they do not count towards suitability. They don't have a number 3 beside them. So they're recorded, and you can see, for example, this agency has 253 people who have self-identified as visible minority, or 22%. They have, what else can we highlight? 328 individuals identified with a disability, or 28% of those service plans. But visible minority and newcomer, we could argue all day that they should count, but they're currently not counted as suitability measures. Length of time in Canada is an interesting, maybe interesting for your agency, particularly if you're in an area where there's a lot of newcomers. Then we have goal path summary information. And it's interesting because it is, well, it may be interesting to you. It's divided into goal path numbers for new learners, for your carryovers who were also here in the previous fiscal year and are still active. And then the bottom one, which is probably the most useful, is a combination of all the goal path data for both new and carryovers. So here's that 1158 number again, 1,158 service plans so far this year. This is the raw numbers of service plans for each goal path and then the percentages.
Excuse me, Barb, it's Wendy. Janet wants to know, would a person with ODSP as their income have the person with disability ticked off?
Good question, Janet. They should.
Yes.
Because if they're on ODSP, they obviously have a documented disability. Because those types of indicators are self-identification, there's nothing to say the person has to check it off when they fill out their registration form. But I think it's pretty common practice that if they have checked off on their form or revealed that they are on ODSP, then we would likely go back and say, you should probably check the box that says person with a disability. But technically they don't have to. Kathy says, I wonder if they will count in the future now that immigration is part of our ministry. I think we've been asking that question of ourselves, Kathy. Kathy's referring back to the previous slide where newcomer and visible minority were listed as things that are tracked in CAMS, but not currently part of suitability. It would certainly make a lot of sense, Kathy, in my humble opinion, or not so humble opinion. Megan also makes a comment that typically ODSP learners will disclose the person with a disability box, but they do sometimes don't want to be identified that way, as Megan points out. Yeah. Lisa has a good point. Yeah, and so does Tracy. There is sometimes a stigma attached to it. Lisa's comment leads into a tactic, or that's probably too strong of a word, an approach that a lot of us use in trying to revisit the suitability indicators with our learners when they have been in the program for a number of weeks and that trust relationship has been built up, or as pointed out also, perhaps catching it at exit. And now Stacy has just put the pop-up PD evaluation survey in the chat. You don't have to do it yet if you can stay on until 3:30, but if you do have to leave, we would love it if you would click on the link in the chat just to give us your feedback about the webinar and what you were able to glean from it so far. But Stacy will repost that later in the chat as well. We get to highest level of education next, and note the number 3 refers to the suitability indicators again in core measure 3. I stuck in the Ontario number for the subtotal of grade 11 and less. So this particular organization has 13% with grade 11 or less. The Ontario figure right now is 34%. Lisa says you can catch a lot of points at exit. Yep, absolutely. It's so important to revisit some of those things at exit. And a lot of the time we have more information at exit about our folks than we did at entrance. Highest level of education, that's in there as well. I'm going to just speed up a little bit here to make sure we get through everything. We have employment experience. So again, if you are someone that fills out those participant registration forms, or enters data in CAMS, these are all the things that you're seeing on the forms and in CAMS. No numbers in the left margin beside the uppermost things for time out of work and formal education. But then we get down to more than 6 years out of formal education and more than 6 years out of training. Those are two more suitability indicators that count. So now, after having said a few times that the numbers represent the suitability indicators, there is actually a little mistake here on this report, which is the same on all of our reports. History of interrupted education is a suitability indicator, but it doesn't have a 3 beside it when you look at report 60B. But it should have a number 3 beside it because it is one of the suitability indicators. Next, we have source of income. Again, there's more number 3s because they also refer to the suitability indicators. A couple of Ontario figures here just to throw in. Ontario percentage of OWs is 14%. This agency has got 3%. They don't get a lot of OW referrals. 11% ODSP provincially. This agency has 1%. Registered apprentices, 2% in this agency, pretty close to the Ontario average right now of 3%. And then I think another interesting one is labor force attachment. So keep in mind that this is the labor force attachment when they entered your program. So there are quite a lot of LBS learners in the province who are already employed full-time or part-time. And so just a quick comparison between the numbers for this particular site and the provincial numbers. I will say that the data reports we're looking at today are from an e-channel program, one of the fully online programs. So it makes sense that there are a lot of employed full-time people in an e-channel fully online program. Okay, just give me, yes, no income is an interesting category. And no source of income would tend to be, just as an example, people who are supported by a spouse, people who are living at home with their parents and maybe don't have an income, or with their guardian or with their grandmother. So those are just some examples of people who would check off no source of income because they're supported by somebody else and because they don't have any employment income or any government social service type income. Jackie asks, offhand how many OW learners there are provincially. I don't off the top of my head. If I opened up the roll-up report, I could tell you, Jackie. I'm going to say, I think there's about, oh, you know what? I can't remember. I'd have to open up the report and I don't want to guess. But you could look at the roll-up report for 60B and CAMS or get someone in your agency to do that who has access and you would be able to tell. Okay, let's carry on here. Assessment information. And you'll notice that there's a number of what we might call more common assessment tools here. Other tends to be those of us that use in-house developed assessments that aren't part of this list. There is a spot here that I didn't copy in because it's really long, that is a placeholder for the learner gains scores and measures if that ever comes to fruition. Right now, we should all have zeros under learner gains because they're not recorded anywhere. But it wasn't worth taking up 2 or 3 slides to show you a whole bunch of blank zeros. We have the estimated learner time commitment. If you have more employed learners, you may have lower weekly time commitments. That kind of stands to reason. Just as an example of one way to look at the data. Getting closer to the end of the report now, we've got language information. Oops, sorry, a little happy on my trigger finger there. So it may be interesting in particular pockets of the province. You may have many learners with the other language spoken at last workplace or other language spoken at home and so on. And then finally, at the very end of the report, referring to to core measure number 5 is learners who have completed at least one milestone. And that is the measure of progress. Should really say who have successfully completed at least one milestone, because that's what the measure is. So the word successfully, in my opinion, should be in there. Oh, thanks, Lisa, for looking that up. 3,503 Ontario LBS learners on OW at this point in time. I'm just going to go back in my chat for a second here.
There's a comment there from Janet. Is the 10 hours learners needs to serve in LBS, or is it recommended?
Now, there's nowhere that it's written that people have to commit 10 hours, Janet. It's not a written requirement for us. So just out of interest, the Ontario percentage rate at this moment in time at the end of August was 58% as well for learners who've completed at least one milestone. Okay, and thanks again, Lisa, for looking up that stat while I was in mid-presentation here. That's interesting too, Lisa. No source of income, 5,003 provincially. I find that in, yes, a little horrifying, Lisa, to think that 5,000 of our students provincially have no source of income. I think it speaks to a lot of some of those things we mentioned, where we do have more younger students maybe still living at home who are not employed, or spouses who are not working, and so on. So learner profile information tells us a little bit about the suitability target, and it tells us a lot about perhaps our program delivery plans, who we're serving, what their needs are. Are they first language English speakers? Are they not? What are their age range? How long have they been out of school? Do we need different supports because they've been out of school for a long time? Do we need to look at our scheduling because we have a lot of employed learners? So it really, as I used that term before, it does give us a bit of business intelligence about our learner profile and how we're serving them. If you want to make an estimate from this report, if you're meeting the suitability target or not, even though it is recorded in the DSQ for closed plans, you can add up all of the places where you have the number 3s. And then you are looking for an average of 3 indicators per learner, or per service plan, I should say, to meet the current target of 30% suitability. We don't have time to delve into that stat a little, today, but it is explained a little bit more in the DSQ report from last year, the DSQ webinar from last year, I should say. Let's go back to the chat here for a sec. Simone says, due to the pandemic, for example, that could be a reason that there are more people with no source of income right now, for sure. And then Lisa mentions, love to see long reports on the roll-ups instead of me inputting all these into a spreadsheet. Yeah, good point. Good point, Lisa. Okay, Kendra's just looking at a question here. Can I ask a question back in the education section? Why is there not a 3 next to history? Okay, yeah, that 3, I'm going to flip back to that slide for just a sec, because that's a really important distinction. So bear with me here while I go back there a bit further. So yes, there absolutely should be a 3 there before history of interrupted education. It's an error that's never been corrected by the minister on this report. Now I'm going to fast forward back to the other slides here. Okay, end of 60B. Let's spend a few minutes on 60D. It's not quite as long and involved. Not to worry, Kendra, no problem. Probably worth repeating that 3 is missing on history of interrupted education anyway. So 60B is 60D, as in David, as in dog, is also produced as a PDF. It's generated monthly. but it's based on closed plans. 60B is based on active plans. Gives you lots of summary information on your completions and your follow-ups at 3, 6, and 12 months. You can use it to monitor your outcomes. A roll-up report is also available. And usually, and I'm going to say usually because you never can be 100% sure with data, most of the data that's in this report, 60D, should match pretty closely or right on with what you see in the DSQ 64 because they're drawing from closed service plans. So let's take a look at a few of the features of 60D. Again, very similar title page. It's monthly. Also, I've pulled the year to date up to the end of August for this particular site. If you're familiar with closing files in CAMS and doing the exit forms, you'll see all these closure reasons listed that you have to check off, one of them when you close a file. Percentages are arrived at based on closed files. So this particular organization had 203 closed files at this point in the year. The outcomes also very exactly the same or pretty much the same as what's on the exit form and what we have to check off in CAMS. So of the 203 files that were closed this year, this was the spread of the outcomes for this particular organization. I'm just going to go back to the previous slide for 1 second because there was something at the bottom I wanted to point out. Unable to contact client. Well, that's what we used to call lost contacts. That's a real challenge for a lot of us still. And I will say that for e-channel, I think it's even a bigger challenge. And remember I said earlier, this is an e-channel report. It's hard to get people to respond, even harder, I think, than in person, having managed both. Hard to get people to respond to those exit and follow-up surveys when you're only serving them virtually, even harder than in person. So lots of lost contacts or unknowns at this site, and that's part of the reason. Yeah, Lisa says it's a good job we don't have a target for response rate. Yeah. We can see the response rate of how many people respond to the exit survey and the 3, 6, 12-month follow-up surveys, but we currently don't have a target for the response rate. So that's a good thing. There's a little section on wages, and then in fact, listing the response rate here for the exits. And can also look up the response rate on the DSQ, but we're not measured on the response rate. It's a piece of information. We have average milestones completed by goal path. We have a placeholder for learner gains. Again, I didn't copy it in here because there's no data recorded about learner gains. It's just a placeholder.
Excuse me, Barb. I think we missed Rich's question.
Okay.
He says, sorry to go back to service coordination, but are there any fields on the registration or exit form or within the learner plan that we should or should not complete to maximize the service coordination number 2 stats?
No problem, Rich, about going back to that. It's a good question. The most important thing about service coordination really is to just make sure you are recording the referrals in and out in CAMS. I think we've all gotten better at that, but there's not any particular tricks and tools other than making sure that your staff, the people you work with, are recording the referrals. And if they are not the person entering them in CAMS, that those referrals are getting communicated to the person who is doing the CAMS data entry to make sure they're getting recorded. If anyone else wants to type in response to Rich in the chat, please feel free to go ahead. I hope, Rich, that gives you just a little bit of information here. Sarah has a question. You're welcome, Rich. On the topic of referrals, it's only required that folks have 1 in or out. So to meet the service coordination measure, yes, only one referral in or out of the ones that count is required, and then you get your tick box for service coordination. The ministry has an expectation that we record other referrals on top of the one that counts, but technically we can meet the service coordination measure just with one referral in or out. Julie says, do referrals during service? Yes, referrals during service do count as well. Yeah. Jackie, at one time our agency was told one referral was counted per learner. So yes, that Jackie, that's almost the same question previously. So one counts toward the service coordination measure, but we are expected to record other referrals as well, even if we're already meeting the one per service plan. All right, how are we doing for time? 3:17. All right, we got another few slides to get through. Janet, you can have many referrals, but only one. Yeah, exactly. So technically, if you only have one, you're still going to meet the service coordination measure for that one service plan. So you need 50% of your service plans with at least one referral to meet the service coordination measure. And again, I encourage you to go back to the DSQ webinar last year that talks in more detail about how those measures are calculated. All righty. Moving right along here, about halfway through 60D, we have information about completions. So remember number 4, the completion measure isn't currently counted, but it is recorded. The information is recorded in the DSQ and in this report. So a few little provincial comparisons on this screen as well. So for example, all milestones completed for this agency, 70% of their the files had all the milestones completed, closed files. Culminating tasks, they don't do them. Learning activities, 94% completed all learning activities. So again, just some provincial comparisons here. Yes, Mira, referral in and out is counted equally, except for the referral categories that don't count. Referral ins that don't count are referred in from an LBS service provider and referred in by word of mouth. Lisa points out there's a good list in the guide that showed, yes. So again, referring back to that DSQ 64 report guide, that itemizes the referrals in and out that count, which is most of them. Most of them do count, but there are a couple of those categories we just mentioned that don't. And yes, LBS referrals in don't count, but they count as a referral out. That's right. Okay, and I'll just zip along here. We also have exactly the same outcomes information at 3, 6, and 12 months as we did at exit. So I didn't paste them all in here because they're exactly the same list of outcomes that you get from your follow-up surveys. And, you know, we aren't currently measured on our 3, 6, and 12-month outcomes or our exit outcomes, but the ministry does track whether we're keeping up to date with our follow-ups. And you will get an action item letter if you're getting behind in your follow-ups. Why do we need to pay attention to outcomes? If we had more time, we could have a discussion about this, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to pop up these little points on here. The outcomes, you know, the result of what learners did in our program are really the impacts of the program. So some of the impacts of the program, positive impacts may be reflected in the outcomes. There's lots of good things that our learners get out of the programming that isn't listed as an outcome that the ministry counts. We know that. You might be able to find some areas for improvement if there's places where your outcomes are lacking, you know, and for a lot of us, lost contacts or unknowns are an area that we struggle with. value for money is what the ministry looks at with outcomes, even though we're not measured on them right now. They're really saying, do the outcomes that you're achieving based on what the ministry thinks are important outcomes, and they may not be the same things that we would say are important outcomes, is your agency providing value for the money that the government is giving you from our taxpayers? So it's really important for us to know, as it says in this, the red blurb at the end that I inserted, to know where we stand with the completion indicators, because even though they don't count now, we should have it in the back of our minds that they may in the future if the completion measure is reintroduced. Rich, I think Lisa's referring to the Detailed Service Quality Report 64 guide, because that's where the service coordination details are found about the referrals in and out. Okay, we're almost at the end here, and we're doing pretty well for time for the last few minutes. We'll take a quick look at report 61, very quick compared to the others, because we can't look at 61 in detail in a few minutes. 61 is called the Case Activity Report. It's a very large Excel document. It's about 85 columns wide and has hundreds or thousands of rows in it, because every individual service plan is a row, and it shows all the data related to the service plans that are not just active, but ones that have a status of open in CaMS, so you've started them, ones that are approved and not yet active, ones that are actually active, and all the service plans that were closed in the current year or the previous fiscal year. That's why this is such a big, long Excel document. Going back to the chat just for a second, when it refers to completion of all milestones, are expected to enter all potential milestones and have the learner complete them all. So yes, for the completion measure is successfully completing all of the milestones. As is also pointed out though, the progress measure is completion of one milestone successfully. So those are two different things. Progress is the measure of how many learners successfully completed one milestone. That's core measure 4. No, first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes. And yes, Lisa, I'm just reading your comment here too. For the completion measure, in order to get that tick box, all milestones have to be successfully completed. To get the progress measure, just one has to be successfully completed. That's a bit confusing, but it's an important distinction. So if at some point in the future, all the completion measure does get counted again, we will have to look carefully at how and when we enter milestones. And Sarah says on that learner's goal path or on their learner plan, on their service plan in CaMS. So the two should match up. What's on their goal path is, I'm probably not explaining that, Sarah. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there. Maybe you can clarify it a bit in the chat and I'll come back to it in just a sec. Okay, and last couple of slides on 61 here. That's what it looks like at the top, similar headers to the previous ones, but notice case status says active, closed, open, and approved. There's a couple of lines at the top for the case owners. These are the people in your organization who are entering the data in CaMS, who own those cases. So Kathy asks, are learners expected to complete all milestones on their goal path? Well, in theory, yes, but in reality, that doesn't happen. It is an unrealistic expectation. We could talk a lot about the performance measures and how realistic and unrealistic some of them are. But right now, the way the completion measure is written, It does say all milestones. Maybe, Stacy, you can pop the evaluation into the chat again, because we are at 3:27. And if you have to leave, please take a minute or two to do the evaluation. I've just got a couple more slides and we'll be wrapping up anyway. Okay, and this is what the top of the Excel sheet looks like. The previous slide, you would notice, ended at row 18 on the Excel document. So the next thing you see from row 18 on is actually where the individual data points for each service plan are recorded. So there's about 90 columns to the right. And in this particular report, because it's a big program, there's about 2,500 rows of data that include all the different service plans in all the different statuses. Little important point about looking at this report: you might not know just looking at the column headers what they mean. So for example, PDB, well, that's probably a more obvious one for us. It's person with a disability. Inuit, First Nations, Métis, obviously those are self-explanatory. But as in some cases, as you scroll to the right in the report, there's abbreviations like PDB, and you may not know necessarily what they stand for. So there is a nice little list in the Report 61 guide that tells you what those column names mean. So if you're looking at Report 61 and you don't know what the column names mean, look at the guide. It's a very helpful way to see what those short forms are at the top of the Excel columns. At the bottom of all those rows of individual service plan data, there is some summary information. So remember I said that this particular report has about 2,500 rows in it. So now I've jumped all the way down to the bottom. And it has a summary of the different statuses of the number of plans that are shown on this report for this moment in time, up to the end of August of the fiscal year. Also does show the goal path summary numbers again. You might recall that that was in 60B as well. The goal path numbers are based just on the active plans and the ones that have been closed in the current fiscal year. So this does not add up to 2,000 and something. It just adds up to, in fact, 1,158, which is the same number of service plans that were active or closed in the current year that we saw in the other reports. Stacy, I don't know if you typed the evaluation. There it is back in the chat. Yep, thank you. That's great. And then just wrapping up now, these are the reports we looked at today. You saw these similar boxes earlier in the webinar. Just a very brief wrap up. 64 is the big one, the one that traces our performance measures monthly. 60B has all of the service plan and profile information for active plans. 60D has the outcome and follow-up information for closed plans. And 61 has all of that stuff together for open, approved, active, and closed. Okay, my last attempt at humor for the day. I hope that you've gotten something out of this. It's always nice to have some new folks on the line in our webinars to ask questions and to get feedback from others. It's nice to have some others who are more familiar to add some comments into the chat that are also helpful. So many, many thanks for all the great questions and so on that you have put into the chat today and the great comments. Would just like to once again thank our supporting cast, our interpreters, Carolyn and Mike, Deaf Literacy Initiative, the ED, Jeff has been online today too. Thank you, Jeff, for helping with the interpreters and arranging them. COFA will be providing a French translation. And thank you, Stacy, Wendy, for your support on the webinar today, and the entire committee for their support. I'm part of the committee too, so we work hard to try and get things together for our pop-up PDs. I'm glad you learned something, Sarah. Thanks for all the positive comments in the chat. Once again, there's a link to the webinar resources. I know you can't click on the link in the webinar, but if you access pop-up PD resources for LBS educators, even via Google, you'll be able to get to the webinar resources. And maybe one more time, Sarah, Stacy, you can see Sarah, Stacy, you can just type the link into the chat for the evaluation. So thanks for participating. Thank you for listening patiently, because it wasn't a very interactive webinar, but I'm really glad you were able to be here and also able to participate through the chat. And there's the evaluation link again from Stacy. Thanks, Stacy. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.